The camera pushes in, an extreme close-up on a single heavy link of a rusted chain. It lies cold and inert against the grimy, splintered wood of a floorboard, anchored by 4 thick, hexagonal bolts. Dust, thick as felt, coats every surface. A razor-thin sliver of muted daylight pierces the gloom from a gap in a boarded-up window, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes in the stale, unmoving air. The silence is not empty. It is a heavy, suffocating presence, layered with the faint, almost imperceptible scent of mildew and despair. This room feels like a forgotten tomb, a space where something terrible once happened and was sealed away. But the faint, rhythmic sound of a shallow breath, barely audible beneath the profound stillness, reveals the horrifying truth. This tomb is still occupied, and its story is happening right now. The story of what happened within these 4 walls is a testament to a decade of stolen time, a chronicle of unimaginable suffering hidden in plain sight. But before the silence of this room became their world, there were voices, laughter, and the simple everyday routines of lives not yet broken. To comprehend the darkness that followed, we must return to the light, to the final unsuspecting moments of 3 young women whose paths were about to converge in this suburban tomb. Each of their stories begins with a normal day, a familiar face, and a single, catastrophic choice. If you find these real-life accounts important, subscribe to our channel to follow other cases. We now go back to 2002, to a young mother named Michelle Knight, walking down a Cleveland street, worried about her future, never imagining she was just minutes away from losing it entirely. The afternoon of August 23, 2002, was heavy with the thick, humid air of a late Cleveland summer. Michelle Knight, at 21, felt a weight far heavier than the weather. Dressed in a simple white t-shirt and worn blue jeans, she walked along West 106th Street, her worn-out sneakers scuffing against the cracked pavement. Her mind was a frantic storm of anxiety over an impending custody hearing for her 2-year-old son, Joey. Each step was a prayer that she wouldn't lose him. It was this deep-seated worry that made the offer of a ride so appealing. The car, a slightly rusted, pale blue sedan, pulled up beside her. Behind the wheel was a familiar face, Ariel Castro, the father of a girl she knew from school. He offered a small, disarming smile and a simple promise, a quick lift, and a chance to see his new puppy. For a moment it felt like a small kindness in a day full of hardship, a brief respite from her troubles. 7 months later, on April 21, 2003, the air held the crisp chill of a lingering Ohio spring. Amanda Berry was finishing her shift at the Burger King on West 110th and Lorraine Avenue, just a few blocks from her home. The smell of frying oil clung to her blue and red polyester uniform, and she couldn't wait to get home and wash it away. It was the eve of her 17th birthday, and a small, brightly wrapped present from her sister was waiting on her bed. She clocked out at 7:10 p.m., pulling her light gray jacket tighter as she stepped outside. The streetlights were just beginning to hum to life, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. She walked her usual route, her mind filled with plans for her birthday celebration, a simple family dinner, maybe a call from her boyfriend. Her final steps as a free teenager were marked by the mundane rhythm of a familiar walk home, her future a bright, promising light just a few hundred yards away. The final bell at Wilbur Wright Middle School rang at 3 p.m. on April 2, 2004, releasing a flood of youthful energy onto the sun-drenched sidewalks. Among the laughing, chattering students were 2 inseparable best friends, Gina DeHiazes and Arlene Castro. At 14, their world was one of shared secrets, inside jokes, and meticulously coordinated outfits. That day, Gina wore a light pink hoodie and carried a purple JanSport backpack filled with textbooks. They walked together, their conversation, a mix of school gossip and plans for the weekend, their footsteps in sync. They had just 50 cents between them, enough to share a small bag of chips from the corner store. At the intersection, they said their goodbyes with a casual wave and a promise to talk on the phone later. Gina turned for the short, final leg of her journey home, alone. Arlene watched her go, never imagining that the familiar car that would soon pull up beside her friend belonged to her own father. 3 young women, 3 separate lives, 3 ordinary days forever frozen in time. Michelle, consumed by a mother's fear. Amanda, anticipating a milestone birthday. Gina, walking home from school with her best friend. Their paths, once distinct and full of potential, were now unknowingly converging on a single terrifying point on the map, 2207 Seymour Avenue. Within a radius of just 5 miles, a predator was methodically harvesting victims from his own community, using the trust he had cultivated as a neighbor, a musician, and a father as his most effective weapon. As the years ticked by, the faded posters of Michelle and Amanda became a sorrowful part of the landscape, silent warnings that went unheeded. The danger was not an outsider hiding in the shadows. It was a man who waved to children from his front porch, a monster living in plain sight, patiently waiting for his next opportunity. In the immediate aftermath of Michelle Knight's disappearance, the official response was muted, almost indifferent. Her case was quickly categorized not as a potential abduction, but as a voluntary departure. At the local police precinct, the fluorescent lights hummed over worn linoleum floors. As officers took a cursory report, their questions laced with assumptions about her turbulent family life and the custody battle for her son. To them, she was another troubled 21-year-old who had likely decided to run away. Her family's desperate pleas were met with procedural calm and assurances that she would probably turn up in a few days. There were no large-scale searches, no media alerts, no canvassing of the neighborhood. The first flyer was a simple black-and-white photocopy her mother made at a local library, its grainy image of Michelle's smiling face taped to a telephone pole on West 106th Street. A solitary, fragile testament to a life the world had already decided to stop looking for. The disappearance of Amanda Berry, however, tore through the community like a shockwave. Within hours of her failing to return from her Burger King shift, the neighborhood mobilized with a fierce, protective energy. The initial search was a frantic, grassroots effort, with hundreds of volunteers in brightly colored vests combing through the dense foliage of the Rocky River Reservation and peering into abandoned buildings. Amanda's face, captured in a hopeful high school portrait, was suddenly everywhere, on professionally printed posters stapled to every utility pole, in the windows of corner stores, and on the flickering screens of local news broadcasts. Candlelight vigils were held on the steps of her family's porch on West 110th Street, the soft glow of dozens of flames illuminating the tear-streaked faces of friends and strangers alike. The FBI was called in, and a tip line was established, flooded with calls that led investigators down 100 different dead-end paths. The search for Amanda was everything the search for Michelle was not: urgent, public, and relentless. When Georgina Gina de Jesus vanished less than a year later from the same few blocks, the community's simmering anxiety boiled over into outright terror. The fact that she was only 14, walking home from school in the middle of the afternoon, shattered any remaining illusion of safety. It was no longer a tragic anomaly. It was a pattern. The FBI escalated its presence, establishing a formal command center and re-interviewing everyone connected to both Amanda and Gina. The investigation zeroed in on the horrifying irony that Gina's best friend, Arlene Castro, was the last person known to have seen her alive. Investigators spoke with Arlene and her family multiple times, seeking any small details she might remember. Standing just feet away during some of these conversations was her father, Ariel, offering words of support to the frantic de Jesus family, his face a mask of neighborly concern. He was a familiar figure, a father himself, and therefore utterly invisible to suspicion. As the days turned into weeks, the disjointed nature of the investigation became a critical, unseen obstacle. The 3 disappearances were logged as separate incidents, assigned to different detectives whose caseloads were already overflowing. There was no central database flagging the chilling geographic proximity, no analyst tasked with connecting the dots between a 21-year-old presumed runaway, a 16-year-old fast food worker, and a 14-year-old middle schooler. The institutional wires were crossed, tangled in bureaucracy and protocol. In one particularly agonizing instance of missed opportunity, police officers knocked on the door of 2207 Seymour Avenue in January 2004 to investigate a report filed by Ariel Castro himself about a child being left behind on a school bus. He spoke to them on his front porch, a calm and cooperative citizen. Just beyond the front door, down a darkened hallway and behind a locked bedroom door, Gina DeJesus and Michelle Knight held their breath, hearing the voices of potential rescuers fade away. The investigation was further plagued by a series of high-profile false leads that toyed cruelly with the family's emotions. Rumors swirled through the West Side neighborhoods, whispers of sightings in other states, theories involving human trafficking rings, and cruel hoaxes from callers seeking attention. The most public of these dead ends came from a television psychic who, on a nationally broadcast show, claimed to have a vision of Amanda's body buried beneath a concrete slab in a local Cleveland park. The tip ignited a media frenzy. For 3 excruciating days, news helicopters circled overhead as police and FBI agents used ground-penetrating radar and heavy excavation equipment to dig up a large section of the park. The Berry and DeJesus families watched, trapped in an agonizing limbo between hope for closure and the dread of what they might find. When the search yielded nothing, the disappointment was a physical blow, a public spectacle of their deepest pain. Years began to bleed into one another, and the active search slowly receded into the city's collective memory. The vibrant posters of Amanda and Gina faded under the relentless Ohio sun, their edges curling and their colors washing out until they were just ghostly outlines on splintered wooden poles. The annual news stories on the anniversaries of their disappearances became a somber local tradition, a brief moment of remembrance before the city moved on. For the families, however, time did not heal. It only deepened the wound. They retreated from the public eye, their hope forced to become a more private, stubborn, and painful affair. The community, once united in a panicked search, learned to live with the unanswered question. The monster of Seymour Avenue had succeeded in the cruelest way. He had made the unthinkable seem normal, turning 3 stolen lives into a permanent, sorrowful fixture of the local landscape. The first major fissure in the family's resolve came not from a police source, but from the flickering glow of a television screen. In a highly publicized episode of a national talk show, a well-known psychic declared she had a vision. Amanda Berry was dead, her body discarded in a watery grave near a set of concrete steps. The declaration, delivered with an air of absolute certainty, was broadcast into millions of homes, including that of Amanda's mother, Luana Miller. The tip, however vague, was specific enough to ignite a firestorm. Law enforcement, pressured by the intense media scrutiny and the family's desperate hope, converged on a local park that matched the description. For days, the area was a chaotic scene of excavation equipment, FBI agents in windbreakers, and news vans, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. The community held its collective breath, watching as the earth was torn open, praying for an answer. Any answer to end the agonizing uncertainty. The search yielded nothing but disturbed soil and shattered hope. As the heavy machinery fell silent and the news crews packed up their cameras, a profound and devastating emptiness settled back over the community. For Luana Miller, the psychic's pronouncement was a fatal blow. She had clung to the belief that her daughter was alive, and this public spectacle of a fruitless search for her body seemed to extinguish that last flicker of light. She began removing Amanda's missing posters from local storefronts, a quiet act of surrender that broke the hearts of those who witnessed it. The family retreated further into their private grief, the experience leaving them deeply distrustful of the media and the hollow promises of outside help. The psychic's vision had not brought clarity. It had only inflicted a new, deeper wound, leaving the families more isolated than ever in their long, lonely vigil. Another promising lead emerged from the fog of fear, this one feeling more tangible, more grounded in police work. A witness came forward, claiming to have seen a girl matching Gina DeJesus' description, arguing with 2 men, before being forced into an unmarked white van on the day she vanished. This tip galvanized the investigation. An all-points bulletin was issued, and for 48 frantic hours, the west side of Cleveland became a hunting ground for white vans. Officers conducted traffic stops, checked registrations, and questioned drivers of every delivery truck, contractor vehicle, and family minivan that fit the description. The lead consumed thousands of man-hours and created a brief, intense surge of optimism that they were finally closing in. But as each driver was cleared and every van searched, turned up empty, the hope once again began to curdle into frustration. The witnesses' memory proved to be flawed, their timeline mistaken. The lead evaporated, leaving behind only the exhaust fumes of another dead end. As the external leads crumbled, the investigation inevitably turned inward, casting a painful net of suspicion over those closest to the girls. Boyfriends were subjected to grueling interrogations and polygraph tests, their teenage relationships dissected under the harsh fluorescent lights of precinct interview rooms. Even family members were scrutinized, their alibis checked and rechecked in a desperate search for any inconsistency. In one particularly agonizing instance, a local man with a minor criminal record, who happened to live near the DeHeese's family, was publicly named as a person of interest. His home was searched, his life turned upside down by media scrutiny for weeks, only for him to be completely exonerated. This process, while standard procedure, sowed seeds of distrust within the tight-knit community, forcing families to look at their neighbors with a flicker of doubt. Each cleared suspect was another closed door, another path that led nowhere, leaving investigators with swelling case files filled with nothing but ghosts and whispers. By 2012, the cases of the missing girls had been relegated to the quiet, dusty archives of the Cleveland Police Department's cold case unit. The thick manila folders, filled with yellowing witness statements and faded photographs, were a testament to a decade of dead ends. But technology had evolved in ways unimaginable when the girls first vanished. A new generation of forensic science, specifically advancements in touch DNA analysis, offered a sliver of hope. A determined young detective, reviewing the files for the first time, flagged a key piece of evidence that had been carefully preserved but never successfully tested. A single, out-of-place fiber found on Gina DeJesus's purple Jansport backpack, which had been recovered from a school locker. He authorized a new analysis, sending the microscopic thread to a state-of-the-art lab, a final, long-shot attempt to extract a ghost from the past and give it a name. The results came back not with a bang, but with a quiet, electrifying whisper. The lab managed to isolate a partial male DNA profile from the fiber, a feat that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. The profile was run through the National CODIS database, yielding no direct matches. The trail seemed to have gone cold yet again. However, investigators then employed a newer, more controversial technique, familial DNA searching. They looked not for the suspect himself, but for a relative whose DNA was already in the system. After weeks of complex analysis, the system flagged a distant cousin of the unknown subject, a man who had been arrested for a minor felony in another state years prior. Suddenly, the search was no longer for a faceless phantom in a city of millions. It was for a male individual within a specific, traceable family tree rooted right there in West Cleveland. The breakthrough sent a jolt of cautious optimism through the beleaguered investigative team. The case, dormant for so long, was suddenly alive with urgent purpose. Detectives began the painstaking work of mapping out the family tree of the distant cousin, identifying every male relative who lived in or had ties to Cleveland between 2002 and 2004. They cross-referenced names with addresses, vehicle registrations, and employment records, slowly building a web that they hoped would ensnare their suspect. The news was carefully relayed to the Berry and DeJesus families, who had endured so many false dawns. This time, however, the hope felt different, less like a psychic's guess and more like a scientific certainty. It was a tangible thread, a concrete path leading out of the darkness. And though they guarded their hearts against another disappointment, the possibility of a real answer felt closer than it had in nearly a decade. As the detectives narrowed their list of potential persons of interest, one name began to surface with unsettling frequency: Ariel Castro. He was a second-generation male in the family tree, a former school bus driver who lived at 2207 Seymour Avenue, a location squarely within the small, tragic triangle where all three girls had vanished. A preliminary check revealed no significant criminal history, only minor traffic violations and a dismissed domestic violence complaint from years ago. He was, by all accounts, an unremarkable neighbor. Investigators began a low-level, discreet surveillance of the house, noting the permanently drawn curtains and the unusual privacy fence in the backyard. They were building their case slowly, methodically, unaware that the scientific thread they were following was about to be violently ripped apart. Inside the house, a different kind of breakthrough was imminent, one born not of technology and labs, but of a mother's desperate courage and a captor's single, fatal mistake. The man who owned the house at 2207 Seymour Avenue was not a ghost or a stranger. He was Ariel Castro, a 52-year-old former school bus driver, a fixture in the working-class neighborhood. His public persona was one of unremarkable normalcy, a man known for his love of salsa music and his bass guitar, which he often played with local bands. Neighbors saw him as a slightly eccentric but harmless figure, someone who would offer a friendly wave from his porch or give neighborhood kids a thrilling ride on the back of his motorcycle. He was a father, a musician, a man who attended backyard barbecues and blended seamlessly into the daily rhythm of the community. This deep-rooted familiarity was his greatest weapon, a cloak of invisibility woven from the threads of ordinary life. The monster they had feared for a decade was never hiding in the shadows. He was standing in the sunlight, in plain sight. This facade of the friendly neighbor concealed a chasm of unimaginable cruelty. While Ariel Castro was at a local bar playing music with his band, his melodies vibrating through the floorboards of the stage, three young women were chained to walls just a few miles away, their world defined by silence and darkness. While he was grilling hot dogs in his backyard during a summer cookout, the smell of charcoal and sizzling meat drifting through the neighborhood air, his captives were being systematically starved, sometimes just feet from the celebration. The duality of his existence was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He compartmentalized his life with chilling precision, presenting a benign face to the world while operating a private torture chamber behind a locked front door, his very normalcy, the most terrifying aspect of his monstrous secret. The revelation of Castro's identity sent a tremor of profound shock and revulsion through Cleveland's West Side. The news was met not with relief but with a sickening wave of disbelief. In televised interviews, neighbors who had known him for years struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster he was revealed to be. "Not Ariel," they would say, their faces etched with confusion. "He was always so quiet, so nice." This was the ultimate moral twist. The evil that had haunted their community for a decade was not an external threat that had breached their walls, but a poison that had festered from within. The comfortable illusion of safety was shattered, replaced by the terrifying knowledge that the person you share a fence with, the man who waves to your children, could be harboring the darkest of secrets. The final, devastating layer of betrayal was Castro's personal connection to his victims. He hadn't just preyed on strangers, he had meticulously targeted those within his own social orbit, exploiting the very trust that bound the community together. He was the father of Gina de Jesus' best friend, Arlene. In the days and weeks following Gina's disappearance, Castro had offered words of comfort to her distraught family. He had reportedly attended vigils held in her name and even participated in neighborhood searches, his face a mask of feigned concern. The image of him consoling Gina's parents, knowing all the while that their daughter was imprisoned in his basement, is a portrait of a uniquely sadistic and predatory evil. His crime was not only the theft of 3 lives, but also a prolonged, intimate violation of an entire community's heart. Following the electrifying 911 call, police cruisers descended on 2207 Seymour Avenue with overwhelming force, their sirens cutting through the stunned silence of the neighborhood. Officers breached the front door and moved through the darkened, cluttered house, their flashlight beams slicing through years of stale air. In upstairs bedrooms, they found Michelle Knight and Gina de Jesus, pale and disoriented but alive. The scene that unfolded was a catalog of horrors. Heavy chains bolted to walls, windows boarded over with plywood and covered in insulation, doors secured with multiple deadbolts from the outside. The entire house was a makeshift prison, designed for concealment and control. While investigators began the grim task of documenting a decade of abuse, a separate unit located Ariel Castro just a few miles away. He was sitting in a plastic booth at a local McDonald's, his capture not a dramatic showdown, but a quiet, almost surreal apprehension in the most mundane of settings. During his arrest, Ariel Castro displayed a chilling and unnerving composure. There was no struggle, no panic denial, no desperate attempt to flee. As officers approached his table, he simply looked up from his half-eaten meal, his expression one of weary resignation rather than shock. Dressed in a plain polo shirt and jeans, the 52-year-old man appeared utterly ordinary, a stark and disturbing contrast to the monstrous reality unfolding back at his home. In the back of the police cruiser, and during the initial processing at the precinct, he remained mostly silent, his gaze distant, as if he were an observer to his own life's collapse. This eerie calmness was perhaps the most unsettling part. It wasn't the behavior of a man caught by surprise, but of a predator whose long, dark game had simply, and finally, come to an end. His lack of overt emotion spoke volumes, hinting at a profound detachment from the humanity of his victims. In the sterile, white-walled interrogation room, under the flat glare of fluorescent lights, Ariel Castro began to talk. His confession was not a single, explosive admission of guilt, but a long, rambling, and deeply disturbing monologue that stretched for hours. He spoke in a matter-of-fact, almost conversational tone, detailing the abductions and the decade of captivity with a grotesque sense of normalcy. He referred to the women not as his prisoners, but as his family, and his house not as a prison, but as their home. There was no discernible remorse in his voice, only a warped and self-serving narrative in which he was a lonely man who had created the companionship he craved. He recounted his methods of control and the births of his children with the same dispassionate detail, painting a horrifying self-portrait of a man incapable of recognizing the profound evil of his own actions. It was a confession of absolute moral blindness. The house at 2207 Seymour Avenue was razed to the ground, its dark secrets turned to dust and rubble in a public act of symbolic cleansing. For the community, it was a necessary exorcism, an attempt to erase a physical monument to a decade of hidden horror, though the scar on their collective psyche would remain. The tearful, globally televised reunions marked not an end, but the start of an arduous new beginning for three women who had to learn to navigate an unfamiliar world, reclaiming lives stolen from them as children. Their story became a harrowing testament to the fragility of innocence and the terrifying reality that evil can wear the mask of a neighbor. In the silence that followed, after the cameras left and the rubble was cleared, what endured was not the memory of the monster, but the profound, unbreakable strength of the human spirit to survive the darkness and step, blinking, back into the light.